All right. 2 Peter 1 and in verse 5 says, "But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue." And then it continues that list. We're going to get to virtue, Lord willing, on Sunday. I'll be teaching that lesson as well. So next week we'll be on virtue. And then I think it's a whole month that you don't have to listen to me. We'll have several other guys doing the next several lessons. And so I know that we're looking forward to that. But the first few lessons have been pretty much a foundational approach to the list. We could have just jumped right in for sure, but the context kind of gives it a lot more depth and power to it and helps us to understand it more. If you remember that the first point in the lesson 4, add to your faith, was that growth in grace presupposes faith. And so faith is not a part of the list. Faith is the frame of the list, if you will. Everything that he'll enumerate, beginning with verse 5 with virtue and concluding with love, is added to faith. So faith is already there. And you kind of see that with the idea of verse 4 that we have been given the promise to be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. That was something that took place in baptism, and that was by faith. And so we have faith. And if we're to grow in grace, it shows that we have faith. If we want to grow in grace, it's going to have to be by faith. That's kind of how we'll continue in a moment. But if a person does not have faith, they're not growing in grace. Because grace is accessed by faith. And we saw that in Romans chapter 5 and verse 2. But also in Romans chapter 5, we kind of demonstrated that not only is grace as in we are washed in the blood of Jesus and been made a child of God, accessed by faith, but the continuation in that grace and growing in grace. So beyond our baptism, we raise up to walk in newness of life. What does that new life look like? God has given us all things that pertain to life, that new life, which is a life of godliness. And so that's what we're talking about, growing in grace. Well, it is a process and activity of faith. And so if you don't approach these things with faith, and who's the object of our faith before we go any further? God is. More specifically in 2 Peter 1, God who came in what? The flesh, right? So Jesus. And so when we talk about faith, it's not just this subjective thing. It is subjective in the sense of it's my faith, but it is inseparably connected to an objective standard. And that standard is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so when we talk about approaching, for example, I think self-control is the one that really comes to my mind all the time. When you talk about having a life of self-control, I think I mentioned that there are plenty of people in the world who have self-control, great self-control, and they're successful because of it, but they're not believers. They don't even care about Jesus. They have not grown in grace just because they've pretty well mastered self-control in one aspect of their physical life. And so it's not these virtues as an end in themselves. You could say the same thing with perseverance. You could say the same thing with brotherly kindness, because it's a word that has to do with my love for my kin, your love for your kin. That's pretty well everywhere in the world. It's not an end in themselves, but in imitating Christ. That's the key. And so if I don't approach it in faith, in Jesus, and I just approach it as some intellectual activity or some human will betterment activity or something to do with, being helpful to a fellow man, and that's it. Doesn't do anything for me spiritually. And so our focus needs to be there. And that's where we're going to have in this latter part of it, if I can ever get to it, examples and illustrations and applications of this in regard to how we would view, for example, a self-help book that may be pretty well psychologically sound, in regard to the study of the human mind and clinical tests and stuff where it has been proven to be effective. You do X, Y, Z, you go through this routine each day, it's going to make your life a lot better. That has nothing to do with our spiritual health and our connection with God. And so it's not about just being a better person. This is an exercise of faith. And Romans chapter 5 talks about tribulation and how tribulation can help us grow. And it only helps us grow if we approach it by faith. So by faith, I see tribulation through God's grace as an opportunity to grow my perseverance and to therefore strengthen my character. And the result is another product of God's grace, a strengthened hope. But that doesn't happen if I'm not approaching it by faith. I can go through some kind of deep, terrible tribulation, and I want to get better by it. I want to get through it, but I don't go to God's Word. I don't go to my brethren. I don't go to worship. I don't think about it in a spiritual way, but I go to a therapist, and they help me out in these kinds of ways and stuff, and it can maybe make me better in some area of life. It won't get me closer to God. You see that? So again, not an end in itself, but an appeal to God's grace to be more like Christ. And so growth in grace, if that's what we want, we've got to have faith, because growth in grace presupposes faith. And all these kind of overlap, and you kind of put them all on top of each other and see the full picture. And so they're just growing off of one another. Faith, then, is the foundation upon which the virtues are added. This is still the first point. Faith is the foundation upon which the virtues are added. So I've not been doing a very good job in asking the question, so we'll start off with that. Number 4, what gives growth in the virtues listed by Peter? Virtue, knowledge, self-control, so on and so forth. What gives those virtues saving significance? What makes them pertain to our salvation? If I grow in this, I'm going to be saved. Why? What gives them that kind of significance? And just a heads up as we go through all this material, the way I wrote the questions was reading through the material and then writing the questions. So that's what you're going to find. Yep.
What I have written down is the faith by which the virtues are to be added is produced by the gospel, both in God's grace, the knowledge of God, and in context of our lives.
Yeah, the context of faith. It's the foundation that makes these worth anything. And of course, the object being Christ, the faith coming, Romans 10:17, by the gospel. And so it's just kind of reiterating what I just said. Just being a self-controlled person generally doesn't mean anything. But if I am growing in that virtue as a product of my humble appeal to and submission to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I'm becoming more like Christ, and it's not just self-control in general, but self-control in the areas framed by the gospel of Christ, then I'm getting closer to heaven. You see that? And you add any number of those virtues in there. And what this does for us, let me see what number 5 is it separates the presence of these virtues in a person from just generally what we might describe as good people in the world. It's not about being a better person. That's a byproduct of being a Christian. We'll be a better person. We'll be a better citizen. We'll be a better whatever you call it, and whatever the context is of your thinking. That's not what this is about. It's about glorifying God, fearing Him and keeping His commandments, and me being saved from my sins by His grace. That's what this is all about. And the way that happens is by faith, not by an appeal to human wisdom. So number 5 is, will one grow in the grace of God by adding any of the virtues Peter listed as a mere response to something observed in the world? That's a yes or no. No. So if I'm just, I get a job or I go to school and there's someone in my class or at work who's just blows me away with how kind they are, how good of a person they are, and what that does is it leads me to pursue those things because I want to be like that person. That's not going to make me a better Christian. It's not going to get me to heaven. It's not going to get me closer to being like Christ. Now, that can be distinguished from a Matthew 5 context where it talks about our good works being on display. And what do people do, though, when they see our good works? They glorify God. And so it should be a product of our faith in Christ. Christ is living in me. And so we're not doing it with a hush-hush mentality where people could misconstrue it as just some way of living according to a human philosophy. But it is known that the way I live is because I have given my life to Christ. And by that, they're going to see our good works and glorify God. And if they don't get it right away, they may ask about it, and we don't take the glory. And so there's a big difference in those two concepts. Peter is not suggesting spiritual value in living according to societal standards. So Romans 12 and verse 2 says what? Do not be conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind. What takes place in that transformation? How does that take place? My mind is being transformed by what? The will of God. That you may prove what the will of God is. And so I come into a situation, I want to know what God would have me to do in this situation. I can know that because my mind has been transformed by His will. And I can walk according to His will. There are good things out there in the world. And what we need to be able to do is distinguish something as just being that's good and profitable in its own way from saving, from the power of God to salvation. And if we find anything good in the world, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue it. But we should pursue it because it sparks our mind to turn to God's will. Because I know that's in God's will. I want to follow Jesus in this. Does that make sense? It makes every difference in the world. You cannot become a Christian, or you cannot get to heaven just by seeing something that you objectively observe is good. There's an objective reality to that goodness, but I'm not appealing to God for salvation. It doesn't work that way. That's as much merit-based salvation as anything. And so all of these words, what are they originally written in? What language is the Bible originally written in, New Testament? Greek, Koine Greek. Did those words have any kind of meaning to people in that society? Absolutely. That's why God chose a language in existence that people could understand. It was a language like English is today. It was the kind of universal language of that day, the broadest language of that time. And He used words that had meaning. Certainly, the Bible gave them a greater depth of meaning. In some cases, even different meanings were given to them. But they had their meaning, and that's why He used them specifically to reveal His will. But it's not, we're going to add, self-control or arte, virtue, is the next lesson. I'm going to add arte in the sense that some Greek philosopher talked about arte. How are we going to add it? As it's exhibited in Christ. He called us by His own glory in arte, virtue. Or He called us to His own glory in virtue. I think we need to understand the significance of that. Because what happens especially is with our youth, and I think that we can become prey to it as well, is that we hear something someone says, whether it's on social media or on the news, or maybe your favorite athlete or celebrity or whatever, and that sounds good. And you kind of make that your mantra. You start listening to them more, and it begins to be difficult to even differentiate between what is actually good and what is actually deceptive. But all of it is us buying into something that really has no eternal significance whatsoever. I'm not going to be a better Christian by listening to any of those. I'm going to be a better Christian by delving in deep into God's Word and letting it change my life. So there's some examples of this in the book. Acts 17. Acts chapter 17. Someone read in Acts 17 verses 28 through 31. Remember, Paul is in Athens. He's on Mars Hill in the midst of all this idolatry.
For in Him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also His offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because He has appointed a day on which He will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom He has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising Him from the dead.
All right, thank you. What do the poets say? We are the offspring of who? That unknown God. Not just any of those gods, but the one that we have given the altar inscribed unknown. There's obviously a God that's greater than all these gods, that is the Creator, that we come from Him. Not, that's what they're saying. Is that true? That this unknown God to them created us? That's what Paul is saying. Your poets are right about that. How were they worshiping this unknown God? in ignorance. They had molded and graven images. They were doing idolatrous things. They certainly weren't going by the old law or the law of Christ. They were doing things that weren't revealed by God. God didn't ask to be worshipped in that way. He didn't ask to even be represented in some physical form. And so they understood that we come from someone greater than nature. And now the nuances of it and the details of it, maybe not, but they understood there's a God too great for us to even comprehend. He's unknown, and we come from Him. And that's a good thing to realize. In fact, that's what Paul is saying. He created us from one blood, every nation, so that we could seek for Him and grope for Him. He's not far from each one of us. Romans 1 says God is manifest in creation. God made Himself visible. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament show His handiwork. And then He revealed, though, Himself in detailed fashion in regard to our service to Him and His law. My point is the world can say something that's true, and often they do, and we can benefit from that to a degree. I think the way we benefit from it, though, is realizing it's true, searching God's Word for it in depth, and realizing that if it's true, it's something that God has revealed, whether it be that nature reveals a creator, design means there's a designer, or whether there's some moral truth. Why is it true? Is it true because they said it? Or is it true because there is an objective moral standard from a holy God, and I want to know all the other stuff that is morally true, and the things about what I'm just noticing that are lacking, or maybe warped or twisted, because there's no way we get it all right unless we appeal to God who created. That makes sense? There's another example of this in Titus 1. In Titus 1, remember Paul is writing to Titus. He's on the island of Crete. And he's talking about the need to appoint elders because they're idle talkers and deceivers. They need to be stopped. But then in verse 12 of Titus 1, he says, one of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. Then he says, this testimony is true. Many believe it was the philosopher Epimenides who actually, it's thought to have written that in a hymn to Zeus. So there was truth in a hymn written to a false god. And Paul is using it to show even the worldly people on Crete know their own reputation. And it's not some good reputation. This guy, one of your own, is highlighting some negative characteristics of the way you live. And that's true. And so these people need to be convinced, as they have given themselves to Christ, that they need to live by the grace of God. Chapter 2, they need to live a holy life, a sober life, and look for the coming of the Lord. That's his point there. And elders are going to be instrumental in making sure their mouths are stopped and the truth is stood up for. But just because they said something true, and it was even of a moral context, they're liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. That's morality. And they know some sense of morality, evidently. Doesn't mean they're the standard, though. It doesn't mean that now I should start asking Epimenides what he thinks about how I should live my life. It doesn't mean that since I've applied these things or avoided these things in this context, that Epimenides said are bad, I'm going to be a better Christian. That's not how it works. Who's the one we're following? Christ. And that makes all the difference in the world. And this is my point. Faith comes by hearing and hearing by the Word of God. So don't fool yourself by thinking that just because I'm listening to this podcast, it has a lot of good pointers from my life. A lot of good pointers, how to be a good neighbor, a good husband maybe, good wife. And it's psychology filled. I'm not saying you can't glean anything from that, but doing it because a psychologist is telling you to do it, doing it because some big shot CEO is telling you this is the way to success, doesn't make you a better Christian. It's not going to save your soul. Does that make sense? It makes all the difference in the world. It completely separates us from others because we're following Jesus. And so, any comments or questions up to this point? Because I was steaming on. All right. Is there any goodness in the world? I'm not talking about the Bible. Any goodness in the world? There is, right? People who are atheists, they see it every day. And we can agree on a lot of things together. There's not many people out there who will take the atheistic, humanistic worldview to its logical end, which is basically Survival of the fittest means I can kill anybody I want because I'm more fit than they are. And if I want what they want, I can take their life. But not many people will follow it to its logical end. And so we'll reach some inconsistencies, and that's what we go off of to ask them to think about what their belief in morality would lead them to if they're honest about it themselves. And so we can agree with many people in the world who aren't even believers in God, period, that murder is wrong. Even simple things in relationships like, it's being more and more accepted today, but infidelity is wrong to most people. There are definitely some morally degraded people out there who would say whatever you want goes. But so there's a lot of those things in the world that exist. I think that is one of the many evidences of the existence of God and of the influence Christ had on the world. So if that third paragraph was a little confusing, that's what I mean by it, is that Christ came into this world. He lived the life that people viewed and they saw, and even the Jews of today will suggest that Jesus, he was a prophet and he was a good guy. He said a lot of good things, but he wasn't the Messiah. So they even realized the morality of the man, historical man, Jesus. And so he left a great influence, but they reject the New Testament. A lot of other people reject the New Testament. I believe that Jesus had such an impact on this world, in addition to his written, revealed word, that the world is a somewhat more moral place than it was certainly before he came. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, just the swelling growth of Christianity when it first came onto the scene, even through its various inconsistencies and apostasies and stuff. Some moral things still exist. And I think that we'd say that about our country. At least it used to be a really good place to live, not because everyone was religiously right, but at least they had some morals. And so there's some goodness that comes from Jesus' influence. Now here's the thing, if I'm going to look to the world for that kind of morality, I'm just getting bits and pieces. What did Peter say in 2 Peter 1? How much had God given to us pertaining to life and godliness? All things. And so, it's quoted there in that gray box on page 24. That's what I meant. If I recognize it's good, I may even recognize, hey, that's a quality Jesus had. Why would I try to imitate that person or apply that philosophy or adhere to that faith when it's not of the gospel? Why not turn to the gospel? That's the feast right there. That's where you get everything you could ever need or want and more. And so that's where we need to go to. You hear all the time, I'm going to watch this show. That show that's portraying Jesus' life, I think it's called The Chosen. I watched a few episodes just out of curiosity because it's real popular right now. And I'm not saying it's wrong to watch it, but you don't watch it to gain faith. If you're doing it, you are wrong. If you're watching it to grow as a Christian, you're wrong. If you're doing it out of entertainment, curiosity, that's fine. Although I think that there would be some dangers there, but just like with other things as well. But the thing is, if I see that show and I think, wow, I can come closer to Christ in this because they're getting a lot of things right and this, that, and the other, and I'm not reading my Bible, I'm not studying my Bible. See how I'm getting things all mixed up? It doesn't work that way. Why would I be just settling for the bits and pieces and scraps? They're just falling from the influences that true Christians have had on the world and not turning to the actual source. Makes all the difference in the world, and I hope that that makes sense to you. Comments, questions up to this point? One more thing as it pertains to that. They may have some general understandings out there. For example, love is a popular thing. I think love is a positive thing to most everyone in the world. Very few, I would think, would hear the word love in whatever language they're hearing it in and think negative about it. It's a positive word. But is it possible to realize the importance and power of love to that degree and get it wrong? Absolutely. People talk about love all the time and actions coming from love, and we stress all the time that's not Bible love. What did Jesus say? If you love me, what? Keep my commandments. And so those things can be twisted. There's a danger with that as well. And I think that's what Paul has in mind when he talks about these fables and endless genealogies. Fables were just stories, fictitious stories with a moral focus. And so like Tortoise and the Hare. I want my kid to be a hard worker, persevere, And so you read that story to them, and you realize that, it's not just the fastest or fittest, but those who are with integrity and hardworking and stuff that are going to get to the end of that race and be successful. I want them to know that. And so that's kind of idea behind even these Jewish fables. They taught moral truths and tried to have some positive objective to them, but they're not inspired of God. So what happens if someone decides they're going to teach a fable and it actually has something wrong in it, objectively wrong? But I bought in that fables are going to make me closer to God. There's a danger in that. And so just because there's some good in the world doesn't mean that's our standard. The only one that is good, remember what Jesus said to the rich young ruler? Called him good teacher. What did he say to him? Only one is good. He's talking about God. And he wasn't denying that he was God. He was wanting the rich young ruler to reach that conclusion by that. You are God. He didn't think it at the time. So he shouldn't have been calling him good in that sense, but that's the idea of objective morality. God is who all good comes from. So why wouldn't we turn to his standard? Larry?
I was going to say, one of the big errors of the world is defining what is good and approaching God with, God will take like an accountant's agenda and add up the good things I did and subtract the bad things, and then hopefully I'll have a bank of good things enough to go to heaven.
Right.
And by using their own morality and such and what they define as being good, so you've got to get away from that, and the only thing you do is go back to the scriptures to define what God just says is good and pleasing to Him. There's a lot of good that takes place in the world, but it's not necessarily makes you righteous before God. It's just a good deed.
Exactly, and that's what this next section really gets into. Is that it's obviously faith is what growth presupposes. It's the foundation you add these things upon, and faith means there's a standard, and that's the standard that we follow to grow in this way. Yes, Steve?
Might add one more verse in there that when the Hebrew writer was warning about apostasy in Hebrews 5 and 12, talking about building up this foundation, he says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their power of discernment trained." So we've got to have that foundation, that footing. We don't ever get to that part, and we're not doing it as we should.
Yes, sir. And it comes to the point where it's not like before every action that you take, you've got to read a verse because I'm doing it because the will of God said. It's becoming almost the second nature because Ephesians 2 it says we were by nature children of wrath. Well, that's not talking about we were born with it. It was we learned it. We learned sin. We learned that kind of life, and we learn this kind of life, and we can get out of that past life. And it comes from, as Steve is appealing to Hebrews 5, I study God's Word, and I grow in the elementary principles, which leads to the meat, and I'm getting to this point where I know God's will, and it's living in me, and I know the Scripture enough to be able to know God's will for me and discern that in any given situation. And I can certainly point to the text. I have it in my heart, but you're exercising what you've studied and applying, and that's what epignosis is. Remember, it's not just knowledge, as is the second of the things added to faith, but it is applied knowledge. It's a strengthened knowledge, and that's certainly what makes us like Jesus. All right, let's get to that third point. Faith is obtained through the righteousness of God. Someone read 2 Peter 1, verse 1, please.
Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who have obtained like precious faith with us by the righteousness of God and Savior Jesus Christ.
All right, thank you. Just to point out, that first sentence under that heading, it should be the faith which growth in grace presupposes. A little thing, I caught it, so I had to change it. So, just so you know. All right, so faith is like precious as Peter is talking about it. He's talking about the people he's writing to having the same kind of faith as he and the other apostles have. And so the footnote in the New King James Version says faith of the same value. So it's impressive to me that Peter is telling me right here that his faith and my faith are of the same value. Paul's faith and Jeremiah's faith are of the same value. But that has nothing to do with me, and it doesn't even have anything to do with Paul or Peter. What does that have to do with? Where it came from. The source. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. And you keep that in your mind as we go through this, because that's really what he's saying here. You might remember in our second lesson in chapter 1 of 2 Peter in verse 2, when he said, grace and peace are multiplied to you in the knowledge of God. The King James Version says through the knowledge of God. And that's the idea of that word being instrumental. What is the mechanism, if you will, or the vehicle where we get grace and peace multiplied to us? It's knowledge. There's something that we have to utilize that God's given us to get to this place of blessedness in Christ. And here he's talking about epignosis. It's the same kind of structure in verse 1, and we see it there in the King James Version again, that faith that is like precious of the same value is by, that's the Greek word in, or through the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God is the standard. Now, if the righteousness of God gives us that faith of the same value, and Romans 10:17 says, faith comes by hearing the Word of God. What is the righteousness of God in reference to? The Word of God. That is a common misconception, I think, that people tend to have. When we read righteousness of God, what might be one of the first things that comes to mind? God's character. God is righteous. That is true. But you'll be interested to know something in Romans 10. Turn over to Romans 10. Romans 10 and in verse 3. He's talking about the Jews who have rejected Christ. Paul's heart's desire and prayer is that they may be saved. But there's something they've rejected. Notice Romans 10 and verse 3. They, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. Is a Jew ignorant that God is righteous? No. He's a Jew. He obviously knows God is righteous. He knows God is holy. He knows God is just. He knows God is a God of wrath against sin. That is plain as day throughout the Old Testament. But they were ignorant of His righteousness. And it said furthermore that they didn't submit to the righteousness of God. Now jump down in Romans 10 to verse 16. He says they have not all obeyed the gospel. And so submit and obey there are pretty much synonymous. They have not submitted to the righteousness of God. They have not all obeyed the gospel. And so the righteousness of God is not that God is righteous. Rather, according to Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, in it, the gospel of Christ, the righteousness of God is revealed, is the standard by which, or through which, the means through which a man can be righteous before God. How did the Jew try to be righteous before God? By keeping the law, the works of the law. Without Jesus, they rejected Him. And that's what he's saying there. They're seeking to establish their own righteousness. And Paul is saying, listen, it's never been the will of God that you're going to be able to stand before God as just by the law itself. All those people that were just and lived as a Jew under the old law before Christ ever came, and they died before He came, they were justified by faith that was obedient, but since they had sinned, the law would not justify them, because by the law is the knowledge of sin, is what Romans is all about. God's plan for a man to be righteous is by faith in Jesus. His sacrifice washes my sins away, and it makes me whole before Him. And so that's why he says in verse 17, it's revealed from faith to faith. Again, the object of faith, the righteousness of God, produces faith in me. That's what Romans 10 and verse 17 is saying. And the point of this all is that I'm going to add to my faith virtue and knowledge and self-control and perseverance and godliness and brotherly kindness and love, because the Bible told me so. Not because you did. Not because my parents lived that way and that's just the way we do it as Coxes. Or that's just the way that we do it at this church. Or that's just the way that it is in my city, Tuttle, America, right? Little country Tuttle, some good morals there, that kind of stuff, or wherever you're from, and you're proud of your hometown. It's not the big city immorality that you see. And that's why I do it, because this is just how I was raised. I do it because God told me to. I'm having faith in Him that if I appeal to His Word and I do what it says, He'll make me right by His grace. Not by my merit, because I've sinned, but by His grace. Comments, questions on that? All right, I'm doing excellent job because no one's asking questions. I think that usually means the opposite, though. Go to Galatians 2, because there's an example of this. That when I read the gospel, it produces, if I have an honest heart, obviously, it produces faith in Christ. And what that faith will do is it will lead me to grow, because it's a new life I'm supposed to grow in. And if I'm not growing, I've forgotten that I've been cleansed from my old sins, right? In verse 9 of 2 Peter 1. So if I read the gospel, it produces faith in me, which will lead to me growing in the way that 2 Peter 1, 5 through 7 is talking about. In Galatians 2, remember Peter is playing the hypocrite, and Paul withstands him to his face. Notice he says in verse 16, we as Jews, he's talking about him and Peter, listen, we as Jews, we know that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. And so you're trying to get these Gentiles to live as a Jew, as if it's necessary for them to be a good Christian and be saved. But even you as a Jew have realized that the old law is not going to save me. And so I've realized that. And based on that realization, he says, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, or Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith in Christ, and not by works of the law. For by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified. You see that? When the gospel was preached on the day of Pentecost, what Peter basically said is that you are completely hopeless, except that God's Son died for you, and faith in Him and being added to His kingdom is the only way. You don't have to be a Jew anymore. Now, obviously the specifics of that came out later, but that was essentially the message. You even killed the Son of God. You deserve hell. And the old law isn't going to get you out of it. And if I hear a message like that, and it does tell me that the blood of Jesus will save me from my sins, that produces faith in Jesus. You see that? And so the faith is the foundation, but it comes from an objective standard. And that doesn't just include my baptism and my becoming a child of God, but it includes everything about this new life. If I veer off after I was obedient to the gospel and I said, okay, I checked that off the list, that's all I needed to do. That was preliminary to me being able to live the way I want to live, or take on any other variation of Christianity, which, as Paul says in Galatians 1, is not a gospel at all. Not a different gospel. There's only one gospel. Then I can still be good in the similitude of Jesus, and I'll be okay. But it's the gospel of Christ that we're following. And it makes a world of difference. Any other faith upon which these virtues are added will not lead to salvation. You've heard it said before maybe that you cannot be taught wrong and baptized right. And so that's even more fundamental than this. If I am taught that I'm saved by faith only, but Jesus still commands baptism, so you need to be baptized. And I think I'm saved at faith, but I go ahead and get baptized. I'm not saved because I was baptized, because I was taught wrong, and so I couldn't have been baptized right. But if I'm baptized because I realize that is where I meet the blood of Christ and my sins are washed away, and I'm added to the one church, then that's a world of difference, isn't it? And so it's not just baptism, it's the Bible baptism in the name of the Lord, Acts 10, by water, but also in regard to getting into the remission of sins, Acts 2 and verse 38. It makes a world of difference. And so if I'm adding virtue or self-control or whatever it may be, because I read it in the Baptist manual, or because I read it in Psychology Today, I'm not going to be getting to heaven based on that. I'm going by the Word of God. There's a Bible example of this. In 1 Corinthians, remember they were saying, I'm of Paul, Apollos, Cephas, and Christ. Were Apollos and Peter preaching different things? He'd go on to say something about that. Were they preaching different things? No, they weren't. He said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase, so he who plants and you who waters are one. God gives the increase. Preaching the same gospel. You see, those in Corinth were saying, I'm Apollos, and I'm of Peter, and so on and so forth. And you notice in chapter 2 what Paul said. He said, when I came to you, I didn't come, in verse 3, I came in weakness and fear and much trembling. My speech and my preaching were, verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 2, my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. If I get up Sunday and I preach truth, but you obey it because Jeremiah said it, not because Christ said it, will it save you? No. So, the object of our faith is what gives faith any saving significance or power at all. Jesus told the apostles, if you had faith as a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you, or you could move mountains. Now, if they had faith in one of the members of the Sanhedrin that they could do that because they said it, would that actually amount to anything? No. They have faith in Christ, and that's what makes the difference. You see that? And so, getting better at self-control or whatever it may be, it doesn't mean anything. It's not by faith in Jesus. And that, I think, is extremely important. Because it's not that I'm suggesting there's nothing good out in the world whatsoever. But there's nothing that is of saving power except the gospel of Christ. You don't want to just be a better person. You want to be like Christ. And I think that makes a world of difference. I appreciate your attention. We're going to be in lesson 5 on virtue, Lord willing, on Sunday.